The sound that woke Caleb Morrison at 3 in the morning wasn't the coyotes howling across the Nevada desert or the wind rattling his old farmhouse windows. It was something else entirely, a scratching, desperate, coming from the direction of the abandoned chicken coop behind his property. He'd been meaning to tear that thing down for months, but like everything else on his failing ranch, it kept getting pushed to tomorrow's list. Caleb grabbed his shotgun and flashlight, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. What he found in that rotting structure would haunt him forever. A woman, chained, barely alive, clutching a Bible so worn the pages were falling apart, and a lantern that flickered with its last drops of oil. Her eyes, when they met his, weren't pleading or grateful. They were empty, like she'd given up on being found long ago. Caleb had lived alone on the Morrison Ranch for 8 years since his wife died of cancer. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained. He kept to himself, sold cattle when he could, and tried not to think about how the bank letters were piling up on his kitchen table. At 45, his hands were already worn leather from decades of ranch work, his face weathered by sun and disappointment. He'd stopped going to church after Emma passed, stopped believing in much of anything except the daily routine of feeding animals and fixing what broke. The woman couldn't have been more than 30. Her dark hair was matted and filthy, her clothes torn and stained. The chain around her ankle had rubbed the skin raw and bloody, but it was her hands that made Caleb's stomach turn. They were covered in small cuts, fresh and old, like someone had been testing how much pain she could endure. The Bible in her grip was filled with writing in the margins, words scratched so deep into the paper they'd gone through multiple pages. Help me, please God. Day 47, day 83, day 127. The numbers kept going higher. When Caleb approached, she didn't flinch or try to hide. She just stared at him with those hollow eyes and whispered in a voice like sandpaper, "I knew someone would come. God told me in the dark." Her name was Sarah, though she said it like she wasn't sure if that was still true. She couldn't remember her last name or where she'd come from before this place. The memories were there somewhere, she said, but they'd been buried under so much fear and pain that digging them up felt impossible. Caleb used bolt cutters from his truck to free the chain from the wall, though he left it attached to her ankle, until he could get proper tools. He wrapped her in an old horse blanket and carried her to his house. She weighed almost nothing. In his kitchen, under the fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered, he could see the full extent of what someone had done to her. Bruises in various stages of healing covered her arms. Her fingernails were broken and dirty from clawing at the wooden walls of that coop. But the worst part was how she kept apologizing. For the smell, for the trouble, for existing. Sarah wouldn't eat at first, said she wasn't allowed to take food without permission. Caleb had to convince her that the rules from before didn't apply anymore. He heated up a can of soup and watched her eat like someone who'd forgotten how food was supposed to taste. She asked if she could keep the Bible, asked if the lantern could stay lit, asked if he was going to hurt her when the sun came up. The questions broke something inside Caleb that he didn't know could still break. He gave her Emma's old clothes and let her shower while he figured out what to do next. The sheriff's office was an hour away. The hospital was even further. But looking at those numbers written in the Bible margins, Caleb realized Sarah had been missing for months, maybe longer. Someone had taken her. Someone had kept her in that cup like an animal. Someone in this small community where everybody knew everybody else's business. Someone who might still be looking for her. Sarah slept for 14 hours straight. Caleb sat in his kitchen all night, drinking coffee and staring at that Bible she'd clutched so desperately. The pages were filled with more than just desperate pleas and numbered days. There were names, partial names, initials, and descriptions that made his blood run cold. Man with silver ring, blue truck Tuesday mornings, woman brings food, sometimes scared. The handwriting changed throughout the book, sometimes shaky and desperate, other times neat and controlled, like she'd found moments of clarity in the chaos. When Sarah finally woke up, she found Caleb fixing the broken latch on his back door. She stood in the doorway wearing Emma's yellow sundress, looking like a ghost trying to remember how to be human. The morning light revealed details that darkness had hidden: a small scar above her left eyebrow, a birthmark on her wrist shaped like a crescent moon. She was beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are when you see past the damage to what they used to be. "I remember pieces now," she said, her voice stronger after rest and food. There was a house, white shutters, a garden with roses that smelled like my grandmother's perfume. A man who said he was helping me, said I was sick and needed to get better before I could go home. But I wasn't sick, I was just lost. Sarah touched the scar above her eyebrow. "This happened when I tried to run the first time. After that, they said I was dangerous to myself." Caleb showed her what he'd found written in the Bible. Sarah studied the pages like she was reading someone else's diary. She remembered writing some of it, but not all. The fear had made time blur together, days becoming weeks, becoming months, until keeping track felt pointless. But the names and descriptions, those, felt important, like breadcrumbs she'd left for herself in case she ever got the chance to remember. The name that appeared most often was Pastor Williams. Sarah's face went pale when she read it aloud. She remembered his voice now, deep and commanding, always talking about sin and salvation and the price of disobedience. He visited the Coop regularly, bringing food and water, reading scripture about forgiveness and suffering. He said her captivity was God's plan, said she needed to pray harder for her sins to be washed clean. Caleb knew Pastor Williams. Everyone in their small Nevada town knew him. He'd been preaching at the First Baptist Church for over 20 years, a respected man who organized charity drives and visited sick parishioners in the hospital. His wife made the best apple pie at every church social. They had 3 grown children and a reputation built on decades of community service. The idea that this man could be connected to Sarah's imprisonment seemed impossible, but the evidence was there in her own handwriting. Sarah described the routine of her captivity with the detached precision of someone who'd lived the same nightmare over and over. Food came twice a day, water in a plastic jug that got refilled every few days. The lantern oil was rationed carefully because complete darkness made the fear unbearable. Sometimes there were visitors, a woman who cried when she brought fresh clothes, a younger man who never spoke but stared at her like she was an animal in a zoo, always supervised by the pastor who reminded everyone that what they were doing was necessary and righteous. The more Sarah remembered, the more dangerous their situation became. If Pastor Williams was involved, he had the entire community's trust and respect. Who would believe a traumatized woman over a beloved religious leader? Worse, if he discovered Sarah was free, what would he do to keep his secrets buried? Caleb realized they couldn't go to Sheriff Peterson. He and the pastor played poker every Thursday night. They'd gone to high school together. The whole system was interconnected in the way that small towns always are. Sarah found a local newspaper in Caleb's living room and studied the faces in the community section. Her finger stopped on a photo from a church fundraiser. There, standing behind Pastor Williams with his arm around a teenage girl, was the man she remembered bringing her food. The caption identified him as David Williams, the pastor's youngest son, home from college. Sarah's hands started shaking. It wasn't just one person who had kept her prisoner. It was a family that everyone in town loved and trusted. The knock on Caleb's front door came at sunset. 3 soft taps that made Sarah dive behind the kitchen counter like she'd been shot. Through the window, Caleb could see Mrs. Henderson from the general store holding a casserole dish and wearing her usual friendly smile. But Sarah was pressed against the cabinet, eyes wide with terror, whispering, he sent her over and over." Caleb realized that even innocent visitors would feel like threats to someone who'd been hunted for months. Mrs. Henderson had brought tuna casserole and local gossip. She mentioned that Pastor Williams seemed worried during Sunday service, said he'd asked the congregation to pray for a lost lamb who'd strayed from the flock, asked everyone to keep their eyes open for someone who might be confused and dangerous to themselves. The description he'd given matched Sarah perfectly. Mrs. Henderson chatted while Caleb's blood turned to ice. The pastor was already looking for her, already setting up the story that would make Sarah seem unstable if anyone found her. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah emerged from her hiding spot shaking. She'd heard every word through the thin walls. Now she remembered more about Pastor Williams' manipulation, how he'd convinced his followers that she was mentally ill, how he'd shown them photos of her during what he called episodes, photos taken after they drugged her food to make her seem erratic and violent. Photos that would destroy her credibility if she ever tried to tell her story. Caleb helped Sarah search through more pages of the Bible, looking for clues about how many people were involved and where she'd been held before the chicken coop. The writing revealed a horrifying progression. First, she'd been kept in a basement somewhere in town, then moved to a storage room behind the church when that became too risky. Finally, transferred to the abandoned coop on what she'd thought was empty land. She'd never known it was Caleb's property. The pastor had chosen it because it seemed isolated and forgotten. But Sarah remembered something else now, a conversation she'd overheard between Pastor Williams and his wife. They were arguing about money, about how keeping Sarah was getting expensive and dangerous. Mrs. Williams had wanted to let her go, but the pastor insisted they were too deep to stop now. He'd mentioned other communities, other situations they'd handled before. Sarah wasn't their first victim. She was part of a pattern that stretched back years. Caleb found his old hunting rifle and made sure it was loaded. He'd never pointed a weapon at another human being, but looking at Sarah's scars and reading those desperate Bible entries, he knew he'd pull the trigger if the pastor came for her. The problem was, they couldn't hide forever. His ranch was isolated but not invisible. Eventually, someone would wonder why his lights were on all night and why he'd stopped coming to town for supplies. Sarah suggested they needed proof before they could expose the pastor, something more concrete than her memories and handwritten notes in a Bible. She remembered a camera in the basement where she'd first been held. Pastor Williams had documented everything, claiming it was for her. Medical records. If they could find those photos and recordings, they could prove what had been done to her. But getting into the pastor's house would be suicide. That's when Sarah revealed the most shocking piece of her recovered memory. She wasn't random. Pastor Williams hadn't just found her walking along some highway and decided to take her. She'd been specifically chosen and targeted. Her real name was Sarah Chen, and she'd been a social worker investigating reports of abuse in religious communities. She'd come to their town following leads about missing women, particularly those who'd been struggling with addiction or mental health issues. Women who wouldn't be immediately missed or believed if they tried to report what happened to them. Pastor Williams had discovered her investigation and decided she was a threat that needed to be eliminated. But instead of killing her, he'd chosen to break her mentally and spiritually, to prove that even someone trained to help abuse victims could be destroyed if you applied enough pressure over enough time. Sarah's imprisonment wasn't just about power or control. It was about proving a point to himself and his followers about the weakness of the outside world compared to their righteous strength. Caleb understood now that they weren't just dealing with a local crime. This was bigger and more dangerous than one corrupt pastor. Sarah had stumbled onto something that could destroy multiple lives and reputations. People with everything to lose would do anything to keep their secrets buried. But looking at Sarah sitting at his kitchen table, wearing his dead wife's clothes and trying to piece together months of stolen memories, Caleb knew he couldn't let them win. Some fights were worth the risk. Sarah's plan was dangerous but simple. She would walk into the First Baptist Church during Wednesday evening service and confront Pastor Williams in front of his entire congregation. No hiding, no running, no waiting for someone else to save her. Caleb thought it was suicide, but Sarah had made up her mind. The only way to stop a man who used faith as a weapon was to expose him where his power was strongest. They spent 2 days preparing. Sarah practiced telling her story without breaking down. Caleb contacted a journalist friend in Reno who specialized in religious abuse cases. They made copies of every page in the Bible and hid them in multiple locations. If something happened to them, the evidence would still exist. Sarah also remembered enough details about the basement and storage room to help investigators find physical proof once they started looking. Wednesday evening arrived with a dust storm that turned the sky orange and made the church bells sound, muffled and distant. Caleb wanted to go with Sarah, but she insisted this was something she had to do alone. Her strength had been returning day by day, and she needed to prove to herself that she could face her captor without falling apart. Caleb waited in his truck outside the church, engine running, ready to get her out if things went wrong. Sarah walked into the sanctuary during the opening hymn. Conversations stopped, heads turned. Pastor Williams was at the pulpit, leading the congregation in Amazing Grace when he saw her. His face went white, but he kept singing. Sarah walked down the center aisle, past families she'd seen in newspaper, photos, past Mrs. Williams, who started crying the moment their eyes met. She stopped directly in front of the pulpit and waited for the hymn to end. When the music stopped, the silence in that church was deafening. Pastor Williams tried to maintain control, greeting Sarah like a concerned shepherd welcoming back a lost sheep. He told the congregation that this was the troubled woman he'd asked them to pray for. He said she was clearly unwell and needed medical attention, not judgment. But Sarah pulled out the Bible, the one with all her writings, and began to read. Aloud, day 127, Pastor Williams brought soup today, but said I couldn't eat until I confessed my sins. Day 134, Mrs. Williams cried when she saw the cuts on my hands. Day 156, David Williams took pictures again. Pastor says it's for my healing. Day 203, I carved help me into the wooden wall, but nobody heard. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each entry. The congregation sat frozen, listening to months of documented torture read in their sacred space. Pastor Williams tried to interrupt, claiming Sarah was delusional and dangerous, but other voices began speaking up. Mrs. Williams stood and admitted she'd known, said she'd been too scared to stop it. David Williams, who'd been sitting in the back row, ran from the church. 3 other women came forward and said they'd been approached by the pastor about helping with troubled women who'd needed spiritual guidance. They'd never seen the women again. The sheriff arrived within minutes, called by someone in the congregation. But by then, the truth was spreading through the room like wildfire. 20 years of suspicious disappearances and unexplained departures suddenly made sense. Young women who'd supposedly left town for fresh starts, troubled souls who'd found peace somewhere else, all lies covering up a systematic pattern of imprisonment and abuse. Pastor Williams was arrested that night. The basement Sarah remembered was found and searched. Security cameras revealed years of documented abuse involving multiple victims. David Williams was arrested at the county line, trying to flee to Mexico. Mrs. Williams cooperated with investigators and helped identify other victims and locations. The story made national news within a week. Sarah's real identity was confirmed through FBI databases. Her family in California had been searching for her for 8 months. Social services launched investigations into 3 other small towns where Pastor Williams had previously served. Sarah's original investigation led to a federal task force that uncovered a network of religious communities using faith to cover up systematic abuse. Caleb kept Sarah company during the long process of healing and legal proceedings. She stayed on his ranch for 6 months, helping him save the property with reward money from multiple agencies. They fell in love slowly, carefully, like 2 people who'd both learned that trust was precious and fragile. Sarah eventually returned to social work, specializing in helping religious abuse survivors. Caleb started going back to church, but a different one, where faith meant love instead of fear. The old chicken coop was torn down and replaced with a garden where Sarah grew vegetables and flowers. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the Nevada sunset, grateful for second chances and the courage to fight for what's right. What did you think of this story? If you enjoyed this journey of courage and redemption, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that remind us why hope and justice matter. Share your thoughts in the comments below about which part moved you most, and let us know what stories you'd like to hear. Next, your support helps us continue bringing these important tales to light.